Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this PestFax foliar disease webinar. My name is Cindy Webster, and I am the PestFax newsletter editor based in Narrogin, Western Australia. I'm hosting this webinar today, and this webinar has been funded by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, also known as DPIRD, and GRDC, as part of the RPM for Greens project. For today's agenda, our first presenter is DPIRD plant pathologist, Kira Beard, who is based in Geraldton, Western Australia. And Kira is going to be talking to us about findings from the 2019 foliar disease surveillance in WA. And then Kira will be talking about what was found in the 2020 Green Bridge surveillance in WA. We then have DPIRD plant pathologist, Jeff Thomas, who is based in the South Perth office, talking about the foliar disease risk outlooks for WA broadacre crops this season.
I'd like to start with the key messages. So I'm going to be presenting on the surveillance of endemic and exotic foliar diseases on broadacre crops that we commenced last year. This is being done annually by DPIRD and is jointly funded by DPIRD and GRDC. In the spring of 2019, our surveillance found mostly stubble-borne diseases on cereals, and these were only very low levels of powdery mildew and rust. So we'll discuss that. And then we're going to look at the 2020 Green Bridge survey, which we recently completed, where we've found volunteer crop plants across all port zones, but there's only a low level of disease on those. And just a reminder, the importance being reminded this year that it's important to manage Green Bridge prior to sowing in order to reduce pest and disease risk carryover into this season's crops. So the surveillance project commenced in July 2019, and it's conducting an integrated surveillance and monitoring program for endemic foliar diseases of cereals, oilseeds and pulses. And we're also looking for exotic pathogens identified as high priority in WA. So the project's co-funded by DPIRD and GRDC, and we have a great team based across the grain belt from Geraldton, where I'm managing the project, down to Esperance, and everyone's conducting surveillance in their port zone. So it's really important for continued surveillance to stay on top of disease risks, and this project is of great value to industry. It's really good to have a project dedicated specifically to surveillance. The surveillance activities we did in 2019 were an endemic disease survey where we looked for the incidence and severity of endemic diseases, that's foliar diseases, across all the different crops, so wheat, barley, canola, oat and pulse crops. We surveyed 172 crops in total, and our surveillance wasn't targeted to areas of high disease risk, but was stratified according to crop area. So we had regional sampling within designated regions, and it depended on what the general area sown to each crop type as to how many of each crop we surveyed. We looked at commercial crops, experimental trials and MVT sites. So as well as the endemic diseases, another part of our activity was looking at high priority pathogens, and we were looking for specific exotic pathogens to prove proof of absence. We surveyed close to 200 crops and didn't find any, so we're able to prove proof of absence of those diseases. These proof of absence is crucial to secure market access, which gives the WA grains industry a market advantage over its international competitors. Now, we also collected 250 leaf samples, so you can imagine our team were extremely busy, and we identified and isolated diseases and viruses from these plant samples. The samples were also shared with other surveys and collaborators, for example, the rust survey, where rust pathotyping occurs by the University of Sydney, and CCDM for their fungicide resistance testing. So they're just some of the ones we shared the plant samples with. The surveillance results that I'm presenting today are being used for developing disease management strategies and they're also being used for research priorities. So it's really valuable to have this data. Despite 2019 having significantly below average rainfall in most areas, we found stubble-borne diseases across all the port zones. So this is showing you the main diseases that we found. And across all of them, we found barley, spot-type net blotch, wheat yellow spot, and Septoria nodorum blotch, and a low level of blackleg in canola. So in subsamples that we took of the wheat leaf spot disease, we found most of it was yellow spot. In 2018, we found similar levels of all these diseases. So it's interesting that despite the lack of rain, these stubble-borne diseases still persisted. In the Kwinana zone, we surveyed oats and we found Septoria avenae blotch on 100% of them. In the Albany zone, there was barley type net blotch as well, and a low level of powdery mildew and wheat. Well, that was on the barley powdery mildew, and also some wheat leaf rust, but at low severity. In the Esperance zone, there was wheat powdery mildew found. Across all the port zones, ramularia in barley, which is relatively new, is proved to be very hard to find, and there were no priority pathogens seen in any zones. So now I'm going to show you a snapshot of the results by crop type. You can access all the detailed results of our surveillance activities on our DPIRD website, and Cindy will email you the link when she sends you the slides. So we'll start with wheat, and across all of the port zones, 52 wheat paddocks were surveyed. So we quantified diseases by determining the incidence, which is shown as percentage of the total number of paddocks that we surveyed, and then severity, which was a 1 to 9 scale. So severity was disease intensity through the canopy, from 1, which was a low level on the lower leaves, all the way up to 9, where the disease severity was very severe from the bottom of the canopy up to the top. So in this table, you can see the yellow spot Septoria nodorum blotch was found in 75% of paddocks that we surveyed, and there was a big range in terms of severity. And the wheat powdery mildew was very low, and as I said, that was only found in the Esperance port zone. Wheat leaf rust was also fairly low, and both of these were very low severity and low incidence. So that was only found in wheat leaf rust was only found in the Albany port zone. Loose smut was only found in Geraldton. So all these disease levels of incidence were very similar to what we found in 2018. The only difference was that in 2018 there was more Septoria nodorum blotch around, whereas in 2019 it was predominantly yellow spot, which we diagnosed with lab testing. So we haven't seen stem rust or stripe rust since 2015, and we didn't see any in 2019 either. Just 4 to 5 years ago, powdery mildew was widespread in wheat. So yeah, interesting that we haven't seen that for a little while either. Moving on to barley, the outstanding thing we saw in barley was that spot type net blotch was present at 86% of the paddocks we surveyed, and that's very similar to what we saw in 2018. The concerning thing is that in Geraldton, where areas sown to barley have only increased in recent years, 100% of the paddocks that we assessed had spot type net blotch, and it was at moderately to high severity. So that's where the 9 comes from, and that was from the Geraldton area. Net blotch was only found in the Albany port zone, or mostly was found in the Albany port zone, and the same for School. And there were no reports of barley leaf rust or powdery mildew during the survey. There were some reports of barley powdery mildew in the Albany port zone, but these were observations outside the project that occurred late in the season, and Jeff will mention that briefly. So 5 years ago, loose smut would have been in most paddocks surveyed, but this is now at low levels, and we only found 5% in barley in 2019 in our survey, and in 2018 it was higher again at 12%. So yeah, that's just interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention was ramularia, which there's a national project on ramularia that we participated in. We sampled 145 barley samples, and of these, only 4 of them, or 3%, came back positive. These were mostly from the Albany port zone. Moving on to oats, all the oat paddocks surveyed were in the Kwinana zone, where oats are predominantly grown, and all of them had, 100% of them had Septoria avenae blotch. There were low levels of bacterial blight and oat stem rust, and these are also at low severity. There were no oat leaf rust observations. Well, we didn't find any oat leaf rust, sorry. Across all the port zones, 28 canola paddocks were surveyed. The big standout was that sclerotinia was extremely low, and that's not surprising given the low rainfall that we had last season. Sclerotinia hasn't been widespread since 2017, but sclerotia can survive in paddocks for years, so reminder not to be complacent about this. For example, this year I was out looking for sclerotia in canola stubble from last year, and I couldn't find any, but I found stubble from a 2016 crop, and the sclerotia were happily sitting in the bottom of the canola stems from there. So they're sitting there in the paddock ready to go when we get sufficient rain and they're disturbed and fall into the soil. So black flag was around, but it was at low, relatively low levels, and it didn't progress much from the leaves and stem. There wasn't much found on the pods. Across all the port zones, we also surveyed pulses. We looked at 10 lupin paddocks, 5 lentil paddocks, and 1 chickpea paddock. In Geraldton, we found anthracnose on stems and pods at low incidence, and in the Kwinana zone, we found brown spot at moderate levels, but there was no sclerotinia at either. In lentils, surveys in the Esperance region found 5% of paddocks had botrytis grey mould, and there was 1 lentil sample that was positive for phasey bean mould yellow virus. So this is a virus that was first found around 2016, and Ben Congdon tells me that there was high incidence of this virus in lentils in 2018. So it's interesting that despite the dry weather and warm temperatures last year, it was still present in one of the paddocks that was surveyed last year. So those are the results from the 2019 surveillance that we did at spring, and now I'd like to talk about the Greenbridge survey that we have recently completed this season. So after February, a lot of regrowth started coming up from that great rain that we got in Feb. And in March and April, the surveillance team drove around each region and reported where weeds and crop regrowth were observed. I'd also like to thank the regional agronomy team from DPIRD who assisted with this survey. So if the people doing the survey knew the grower and obtained permission, then they went in for a closer look at what was making up the Greenbridge, and if there was any disease or insects present, then they could take a leaf sample. But yeah, if they didn't know whose paddock it was, then they just took, they just reported it as this, yes, there's Greenbridge present and it looks like a cereal. So we don't have disease for all the reports, but we do have the overall thing is that we know where the Greenbridge was. So we didn't cover all areas, but we covered quite a large area, so I'll show you on the map. A lot of the Greenbridge was patchy in paddocks or on roadsides, but some paddocks, mostly in the central wheat belt, were full of regrowth wheat or barley, and that's where these photos from Deb Donovan come from. Yeah, if you could be mistaken for thinking it's an actual crop from a distance. So some of the regrowth cereals are at grain fill, and some of them are at the 3-leaf stage. So there's quite a broad range. So here are the Greenbridge survey results. So as I said, we did this survey from mid-March until the end of April. And the survey extended from north of Geraldton all the way down to Esperance. We didn't go everywhere, but we covered a fair area. So all those dots that you can see are places we went. If there was no Greenbridge, there's a blue dot. If there were weeds only, it's a black dot. And if there were volunteer cereals present, there's a green dot. So you can see there were a lot of green areas, and particularly around the central wheat belt. So in most areas, there hasn't been much rain since February, but surprisingly, a lot of the regrowth is looking quite good, especially around the central wheat belt on the south coast. So a low level of disease was found on volunteer cereals, and in these red circles you can see this is mostly net blotch on barley that we found. The other recent find our team have found rust on grass weeds, wild oats and belt grass in the Esperance region. So that's a warning that conditions are all right for rust on weeds at the moment in the Esperance area. So I wanted to finish off with showing you the rainfall totals from the 1st of Feb to the 30th of April. This is from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. And to overlay our Greenbridge survey, you can see that the most of the significant Greenbridge cereals found around the central wheat belt here equate to where more than 100 mils of rain fell. So most of it fell in February. And there's also other areas that have Greenbridge as well, but the paddocks that have a significant amount of volunteer cereals are in that central region. So most of the Greenbridge there is north of the Eastern Highway up to Wongan Hills area. So the high risk areas where existing Greenbridge is likely to persist with May rainfall are likely to be in the central wheat belt and on the south coast. I hear that Albany got 42 mils overnight, so that's impressive, and Merredin got 37 mils, but a lot of other areas didn't get anywhere near that, so it was a bit patchy, but yeah, enough to keep Greenbridge going. So we'd like to encourage you to please report disease finds if you find disease on Greenbridge or else on crops to PestFax, and this is easily done via the PestFax Reporter app. I'll now be handing over to Jeff Thomas, who's going to be speaking about the implications for crops this season.
Thank you, Kira, and welcome to everybody. Look, I'm going to be quickly covering off on a little bit of maybe some of the implications of what Kira's been talking about, and probably to a fair degree reiterating some of the good messages that that Kira has already given us. I wanted to start with a little bit of plant pathology 101. So I wanted to go back and talk about a disease triangle. So the expression of disease in a crop or in a plant is obviously going to be related to three major components. That is the presence of the pathogen, a susceptible host, and a suitable environment. What Kira has been describing for us is that her survey has certainly indicated that many of the pathogens that we might expect are well and truly present within our cropping region. So we are aware of what pathogens are out there, and that's what that sort of survey is about. In terms of host, it's both the abundance and the susceptibility of the host. And Kira, and so you know, we've got 4 million hectares of wheat and a couple of million hectares of barley and 1 million hectares of canola, and so there is an abundance of host material out there, and and understanding that the susceptibility of that host is a key plank in the driver of disease epidemics. And Kira referenced one disease that we've seen change in something like loose smut in barley. We know that 4 or 5 years ago, loose smut in barley was something that we talked about endlessly, and was related to a fair degree to the dominance of varieties such as Hindmarsh and Latrobe and others, which were more susceptible to that disease. So certainly the susceptibility of the host is an important component of that disease triangle. The third component is obviously the environment and the suitability of the environment for the disease to occur. And we know that the 2019 season, as Kira has already outlined, was possibly a less than favourable environment for many diseases, and so that is an important component of the disease triangle. So quickly, and probably without trying to reiterate too much of what Kira's already said, what did the survey from 2019 tell us in terms of what pathogens are out there? Well, what it did say to us is that stubble-borne diseases persist even in less favourable years. So inoculum for these diseases will be present this season. So we know that, as I said, there are many hectares of wheat, barley, oats, canola. So therefore, there are many hectares of wheat, barley, canola, oats infected with various diseases that will be there and waiting for this season. One of the ones that obviously has dominated the, I guess, the airwaves in the last couple of years is spot type net blotch. And I guess the interesting thing is that that was pretty much ubiquitous in its appearance across all port zones and nearly all the crops we visited. This will continue to be a threat this season. It is given the susceptibility of varieties that we use, this is continuing to be a threat. I think another stubble-borne disease, net type net blotch, is a bit of a latent threat in the southern regions, and Kira's reference to 40 mils in Albany overnight would suggest that potentially this year may be setting up to be a favourable year for something like that. There was a potential shift in virulence of barley powdery mildew in the Albany port zone, with Rosalind being negatively affected by that. So the persistence of that and what impact that will have will be investigated further this year, but certainly there were some paddocks of Rosalind that that showed greater disease levels than may have been expected from its disease ranking. Interestingly, the incidence of rust and mildews has diminished over the last couple of seasons, and certainly last year most of the detections that we found were late in the season. The seasonal weather this year will determine the importance of that disease for the 2020 season. It wasn't part of our survey directly, but certainly we submitted samples through the survey to the CCDM, and one of the things that came out of our samples, and certainly the wide range of samples the CCDM are collecting, is that DMI fungicide resistance in net blotches continues to be an important factor in understanding the management of that disease. What did the 2020 Green Bridge survey suggest to us? Well, obviously, as Kira quite clearly pointed out, there is a green bridge that exists in some areas, and particularly that sort of north of the Kwinana port zone and south of the Geraldton port zone, where the February and March rain was most abundant. There has been a lot of spraying, obviously, and crops and burning that has resulted in a reduction of green bridge in paddocks going into crop this year. But where that persists in paddocks that aren't being cropped, that haven't been sprayed, in fence lines, in roadsides, there's a chance of development of rust or mildew. And so certainly monitoring and reporting will be the key for those diseases this year, considering that we haven't seen a lot of them in recent years. As Kira mentioned, grass weeds, including wild oats with leaf rust in the Esperance district, indicates a little bit some risk for that zone, Also indicates the potential for crown rust in oats this season, where we've got a green bridge and wild oats are germinating. It is fair to say that the relatively dry April in a lot of regions will have moderated some of this risk, but as Kira mentioned, some of that green bridge is quite advanced, and so potentially could be hosting some of those rust diseases. The other thing, obviously, that the conditions which develop the green bridge also impact on is the maturity of the fungal fruiting bodies on stubble and some of those stubble-borne diseases. And certainly, so the rainfall and temperature through summer and autumn combine to determine the maturity of the fruiting bodies and the release time of spores from that stubble. And this can influence, well, I mean, sowing date is one of the ways that we could address that, but certainly planning for the requirement for foliar fungicide or even the utilisation of seed dressing or in-furrow fungicides. And then obviously a couple of models that are available through the DPIRD website, the black spot for black spot in field pea, and the latest model runs are available on the DPIRD website, but these the predictions of spore release and crop disease risk are variable across the regions of WA, but the most recent updates suggest that spore release is likely to be underway everywhere. But in some of the southern regions, more than 60% of spores have been released, and it's probably safe to sow from about the prediction period is the 11th of May. From mid-May, it's probably reasonably safe to be sowing field peas in those regions. Blackleg in canola is another risk assessment model that's available through the DPIRD website, and that will be, I think, the first prediction will be loaded today, and that map shows a regional gradient of stubble maturity from sort of the southern regions to the northern regions, with a high to moderate risk of spore showers coinciding with seedling emergence across the southern regions. And certainly the rainfall that Kira mentioned in some of those southern regions will help to further develop that risk and also to allow germination and emergence of canola crops. A model that's not available but is sort of in development is a yellow spot maturity model. Obviously, we've had some rain that occurred in February, March, but that rain predominantly occurred whilst temperatures were too warm for fruiting body production on wheat stubble. And so with cooler weather, the maturity and the cooler weather and rainfall, the maturity will progress as the season breaks and crops emerge. So generally speaking, the maturation of fruiting bodies in stubble is probably limited in a lot of regions, and the preliminary model outruns suggest that it will have commenced in the Albany and Esperance zones, and certainly some of that rain that Kira mentioned, say through some of the wheat belt overnight, will have further developed the maturation of spores. So look, I think the key message is I'm not going to move a lot into discussing management unless there are questions about that in following this. But the key messages, and again, I want to bring this back to thinking about the disease triangle, the elements of the disease triangle that contribute to a disease epidemic in a given season. So in terms of the pathogen, what we know is that coming out of the 2019 season, there's an across-the-board lower level of disease in 2019, and so potentially a slightly lower level of inoculum for many diseases coming out of that season. But apart from that powdery mildew change that we talked about in the Albany region, there's really been no major changes in the disease spectrum in 2019. And so at the moment, with the evidence that those surveys have collected, there are no surprises waiting for us in terms of diseases that might occur this year. Having said that, we know that stubble-borne diseases still persist. There's a lot of stubble, and that the survey showed certainly in oats with septoria, and wheat with yellow spot, and in barley with net blotch, that those diseases were still present high incidence, even though the severity may have been reduced. And so therefore, it is reasonable to expect coming into this season that those diseases have a significant reservoir of pathogen available to create disease. Obviously, continuous cropping exposes new crops to the greatest inoculum load. And that is certainly part of the component, a significant component of the risk associated, or the development of spot blotch that we've seen in Western Australia, the increase in the area of barley, the susceptible host that is mostly grown, given the options that are available, and then obviously the fact that many crops are being sown onto barley stubble or onto 1-year-old or 2-year-old barley stubble, which still contains a significant risk of inoculum. The suggestion is that spore release from some of these cereal diseases from this stubble, given the relatively dry April, may in fact coincide with some of the early crop development, and so we may see, certainly in some of those continuous cereal crops, some seedling disease this season. As Kira mentioned this, but it's an important one to remember, that inoculum of some diseases persist over many seasons, and certainly something like sclerotinia or even many of our root diseases, we need to not just think about what was in the paddock last year, but maybe what was in the paddock 2 or 3 years ago. So for sclerotinia, obviously sclerotes last for 5 or 6 years, and we know that certainly sclerotinia in say 2017 was far greater than it was in 2019. So think about what was in the paddock a couple of years ago. When was the last time that you were growing this host in this paddock? And I guess the other pathogen message is, in areas where green bridge was present, we need to monitor closely for some of those green bridge diseases, the rust or mildews. And as I said, the detection of crown rust on wild oats in the Esperance district certainly demonstrates the capacity of rust to develop on a susceptible green bridge. So whilst the inoculum carried into the season from previous seasons may be low, the presence of green material in those regions is certainly an indicator that some risk exists. We talk about key messages in terms of environment and host. I'm just going to refer to a median rainfall season. And so, in a median rainfall season, given the outcomes of the survey, crop disease is likely to remain a constraint. And certainly the outlooks that I've seen just in preparing for this today suggest that 2020 looks to be that it could be a median or better season, and certainly the outlook for the season from sort of mid-May forward is quite positive for the next for May and June. A mid-May break, which is I guess what we might be expecting, again, given some of those mid-term outlooks. A mid-May break of season provides opportunity for good crop growth, a good canopy development, and suitable conditions for development of diseases over the growing season. And so the outlook in terms of a mid-May break and a reasonable, a medium to better season certainly suggests that these are conditions that are amenable for disease development. In terms of your host nodes, the susceptibility of your variety, monitor that and monitor for those diseases you know it's susceptible to. This is a really important component. We know up front what the weaknesses of our variety are. We know we've got a good indication from the survey material that of what diseases are around. So we should be able to be out and about looking for monitoring for these diseases, and it really is the key to good crop disease management. Just bearing in mind that if you look through the wheat variety guide, some of the new wheat varieties have some greater rust susceptibility than previous varieties. Again, if we're growing a new variety or we're aware of a disease risk, it pays to go and look at your variety guide and understand the risks associated with the varieties you're growing. That's one corner of the disease triangle. Finally, the only thing I'll say about management, we have had a reference to fungicide resistance, and I guess a message that I like to put forward is to remember that foliar fungicides are a finite tool, so we should be using them wisely. If you actually need to ensure that we're getting actually going to get a positive return on investment from the use of our fungicides. Finally, and I'm using a lot of time here, so finally I just want to refer to a couple of useful links. As I mentioned, the model pages on the crop disease page. The surveillance data is available at that site on the DPIRD website. And I just want to make reference to monitoring and reporting. It's an important part of monitoring and reporting that we report back when we detect any diseases in crops or occurrences of disease, and that can be done by contacting PestFax or through the PestFax Reporter app. And I think Cindy will leave that there.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. And that brings us to our question and answer session. As I mentioned before, we've had some questions come in through the chat option. We have a little bit of time left for maybe 1 or 2 questions, but if you do have a question or comment and we don't have time to answer them right now, please send them through to the PestFax email address that is written on the screen. So I'm just going to ask Kira and Jeff, if you can both please turn on your microphones, and I'm just going to read out the first question. There appeared to be quite a bit of rainfall east of Merredin. What were the Green Bridge surveys like out that way? That might be more for Kira, I think.
Yes, that's a great question. Unfortunately, we didn't get out that far. We were rather restricted due to COVID-19 in the time that we could have for the survey, and yeah, we could only go with limited manpower. So unfortunately, we don't have any responses for that area, but we would be keen to hear from anyone who can get out there and report back. That would be really appreciated if you could report to PestFax.
Okay, thanks for that, Kira. Another question was, can you tell us anything about the virus situations going into 2020? I'm not sure if either Kira or Jeff would like to take that one on.
I can answer, I'll just briefly from my understanding of what Dusty presented in the previous PestFax webinar. There's very few aphids around, despite them checking a lot of regrowth canola around the place. So yeah, the risk appears to be fairly low from any aphid-borne viruses. But Jeff, do you have anything to add?
I guess my only comment in terms of a virus circumstance is that potentially one disease that has been associated, which we see not that commonly, but wheat streak mosaic virus is certainly something that if in situations where crops have a significant amount of say wheat regrowth, and that is knocked down immediately prior to sowing, and that it has been infected with wheat streak mosaic virus, then that is a circumstance in which transfer of from the dying green bridge to the emerging crop can occur. So that is possibly the only other circumstance that I could see that may be of an issue. But that disease is not widespread necessarily in its occurrence.
Okay, thank you, Kira and Jeff. And I think we've got time for the one last question. What are the plans for Ramularia survey this year?
Well, the question was, what are the plans for Ramularia surveying in this season?
That's correct, Jeff, yes.
Yes. Okay, so just a quick background for everybody. Ramularia was obviously detected in WA in 2018, or confirmed in WA in 2018 from the Albany Port Zone. There are 2 components to Ramularia surveying in WA. So the surveying activity that Kira has outlined has where we enter into barley paddocks and take samples. Those samples are observed for the presence of diseases, and those suspected to have Ramularia are submitted for testing through molecular testing through the diagnostic laboratories. There is also a national surveillance project for Ramularia, which is managed through Andrea Hills in the Esperance office. That also has a widespread sampling of barley paddocks, collection of seed from both NVT and from bulk handling, and testing through molecular methods. So there is continued widespread testing of barley paddocks and of barley seed for the presence of that disease and that will continue this season.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. So I would like to thank you all very much for attending our PestFax foliar disease webinar today. And I would like to say a very big thank you to our presenters, Kira and Jeff, for their time and their expertise presenting to us today. I would just like to say goodbye for now, and we would like to wish everyone a safe and great season. Thank you. Goodbye.